Good evening. How is everybody doing tonight? So I'm Jason Bertolacci, and I'm here on behalf of the Colorado Office of Outdoor Recreation Industry. And before I get into the office and what the office does, let me start here. I just got back from the Western Slope from my annual spring pilgrimage to kick off Brown Powell season. For the uninitiated, that is mountain biking season. And when I came back on Monday, my Instagram feed was filled with pictures of friends and neighbors who'd gone on similar adventures, posting up pictures of them biking down a sinewy thread of single track outside of Fruita, Colorado, or a perfectly framed Colorado sunset looking out the back of their van life camper van. And on those beautiful pictures, they tagged them with, "Outside is free." It's a double entendre to capture both the freedom that we feel and that we associate with one another, the community of freedom we get outside, but also the miraculous political achievement of taking large swaths of America, some of our most special places, and reserving them for free public use, our true great national treasures. But I promise you, the mountain bikes that they're on and those camper vans that they're on are not free. So that's the ethical dilemma that I would like us to consider. But before we delve into that, let's talk a little bit about the Colorado Office of Outdoor Recreation Industry. So as you heard, Colorado has about 500,000 jobs of our neighbors, our community members, that are employed within the outdoor recreation industry. About $63 billion of economic impact. That is about 18% of our gross domestic product and about 10% of our labor force. Let that sink in for a second. It is a big industry. And we're not alone. At a national level, it's about 7.6 million jobs and 2% of GDP. It's a sleeping giant that is beginning to awaken. And so what is happening around the country and in Colorado is state governments are creating offices of outdoor recreation industry to support and promote these industries' growth in a sustainable fashion. And interestingly, it started in Utah, and it started around conflicts over the selling off of public land. As some people might be aware, Utah doesn't have a particularly, how should we say it? Utah wants its public lands back. Let's just put it that way, and has been demanding its public lands back. But the industry that was in Utah wanted to keep those lands public. And so that industry pulled one of the largest outdoor recreation trade shows, outdoor retailer, out of Utah. And because of the good policies, the progressive policies in Colorado, placed it here, 40,000 people. But what the economic numbers don't tell us is the competitive advantage that Colorado gets from our outdoors. Think about the story you often hear. Somebody moves out here. They might come out here just for a winter time, just to ski, and then they stay. They start a family. They start a business. Even businesses that are outside of the outdoor recreation industry, they benefit from the great outdoors. And so we have an obligation as an outdoor industry to think about our role in protecting not only the places that we play and where our products are used. If they get manufactured in Colorado, then they go out to the trails in Crested Butte, the trails in Gunnison. And people are here for that reason. In the State Comprehensive Recreation Report, about 92% of people in Colorado regularly recreate in the outdoors. And it's an ethical industry. Think about what Vail Resorts has done with their epic promise, zero emissions promise. Aspen is putting its money behind conservation with their Give a Flake promotion. I love the promotion. And so there's good things that are happening in the industry that we should be proud of beyond the amount of jobs that it provides and beyond the economic impact that it gives. So the Colorado's Outdoor Recreation Office has the vision of galvanizing and bringing these folks together and waking the sleeping giant so it understands the power that it has within the state and the responsibility that it has within the state. And it has 4 pillars: conservation and stewardship, health and wellness, education and workforce training, including the partnership with Western and the Outdoor Industry MBA program. And so those pillars are adopted not only by Colorado, but by a growing group of states around the country. 8 states have created these offices. States that are geographically and politically diverse as Utah, Colorado, Oregon, Wyoming, Vermont. And there's 8 more on the way. So the numbers that we talk about in the outdoor recreation industry, these aren't fuzzy numbers from the industry advocating for itself. These are the numbers of the government's Bureau of Economic Analysis. And so the reason other states are creating these offices to promote outdoor recreation within their own states is to get a slice of that pie. So let's return to that van. And let's return to that carbon fiber mountain bike. And let's think about the ethics there. Because what I would offer is that the outside indeed is not free. It's not free to participate in the outdoors, and it's not free to preserve these places that we love. And let's take that one first. Colorado in 2000 had about 4.1 million people. In 2040, we'll have about 8 million people. We'll double in population. In Colorado, there's 30 million of public lands, depending on how you define public lands, which is about 45% of the state. If 92% of the people in Colorado are here because they love the outdoors, or at least they participate in the outdoors regularly, there's an impact to that. There's an extractive impact to that. So traditionally, outdoor recreation users have been divided up into 2 groups. You have consumptive users and non-consumptive users. Consumptive users are those who actually harvest something from the land, so hunters and anglers. And those groups give back in taxes to the lands and to wildlife specifically. So in 1937, hunters got together and realized that if they didn't manage wildlife, there was going to be no wildlife left in this country. It would just be hunted out of existence. And so they imposed a self-tax on themselves, a steep one, up to 11%, in the Pittman-Robinson Act, 1937. Think about the foresight. Think about trying to do that again today, trying to muster that type of political will. It was followed by the Dingell-Johnson Act for fishermen, anglers. But what about the rest of us? If there's another 4 million people coming to Colorado, Think about Gothic Road on July 4th weekend. It might as well be Colfax in Denver. There's so many cars on it. So we have to think about growth in a comprehensive way in this state. And we've done this before. These aren't unsolvable problems. So 30 years ago, under the Romer administration, there was a serious conversation about how to handle growth in Colorado. It was a conversation that happened around the state. And about what we hold dear about the state. And for a lot of that is our natural resources. It's our outdoors. It's these places that we love and recreate in. And so out of that came Great Outdoors Colorado and the lottery to fund the management of these lands. And the unfortunate fact is that a lot of this does come down to managing the land appropriately and having the appropriate resources financially to do so. And so while this population growth increase is happening in Colorado, what's happening to federal land manager budgets? The Forest Service is getting more money, right? They should. Are any land managers in here? It's exactly the opposite. The funds are dwindling. And so we're going to have to figure out, as a team, ethically, how we're going to get together as a community, as the outdoor recreation industry, as the users of the outdoors, and we're going to solve that problem like they did 30 years ago with Great Outdoors Colorado. How we're going to do that for the next 30 years, how we're going to do that for the next 50 years. And it's probably going to come down to some things that we really don't like. It's probably going to come down to fees, to taxes. We're going to have to come up with a way to fund things. But another ethical dilemma that raises is the question of equality of access. Playing in the outdoors is a privilege. It's a privilege of the chance of where we live or the choices that we've made to be proximate to these locations, of these beautiful places, these trails, these rivers, these waterways. It's a privilege of what our parents, our neighbors handed down to us in terms of knowledge of how to recreate in these areas responsibly and safely. And it's a privilege that hasn't been extended to everybody. And primarily in low-income communities, both in rural communities and in urban communities, there's a huge deficit in the equality of access. And if we start talking about we need to figure out ways to appropriately fund the management of these lands, and if that question, and the answer to that question is that we need to generate revenues, that widens the gap of equity to access to these places. But again, these aren't unsolvable problems. New Mexico, which is one of the next states, it was about the 9th state that created an Office of Outdoor Recreation Industry. When they created that office, they also created an outdoor equity fund. So they're actually putting money into a fund to give out to micro grants that go to nonprofits, Native American tribes, local governmental agencies to run educational and outdoor recreation programs. So when we think about these different issues that are facing us, and then the ripple effects of what we do to fill them, to fix them, hopefully this starts a conversation for tomorrow about how the industry has a responsibility not only to provide jobs, not only to have an economic impact for our GDP, but also to preserve these places, to be a good neighbor to our communities, and to think about issues like equity of access. Because my story is probably a lot like a lot of your stories. I was living in Kansas, and I wanted to make a lifestyle change, right? I wanted to go to Colorado because it was cool. I was a mountain biker. And I got out here, I worked in the tech industry for probably another decade, but it wasn't fulfilling. But I did fall in love with the outdoors. And after doing a through ride of the Colorado Trail, I realized it was time for me to give back. And so I started volunteering at a local trail advocacy organization, and eventually ended up employed in this industry, and now work on policy in this industry. But what's instrumental about that is I found my passion through recreation, through the love of the place. And so if we're not able to bridge the gap to the next generation, which honestly is not going to look like me, then where do we find the next group of people who are going to fight for the places that we love, who are going to vote to preserve the places that we love? And so that is our challenge. And so what I would ask of all of you is to engage in this conversation. Engage in it with the governor. Engage in it with your county commissioners. Let's have a conversation about growth in Colorado, its impacts, and how we manage it. Because the outdoor industry has a lot of ability to affect this. With the impact that it has on our economy and a bipartisan message. Think about when somebody advocates for the environment or outdoor places, and they do that from an advocacy or a political organization. You kind of know what those organizations are going to say already. But when somebody comes from the administration of the current governor and says, I speak for the outdoor recreation industry, and I speak for all of Colorado's citizens, that's a very different ask. And so not only can you make the argument that these places are intrinsically valuable, just because they are, but you can also make the argument that they're valuable for the economy, for jobs. And whether we like it or not, we have to govern together. We often look across the table and we might see somebody of a different political ideology, and immediately we judge. We think we know what motivates them. But the honest truth is, they vote too. They love the country too. They love our neighborhoods and our communities too. And we have to come up with arguments that brings everybody along. We can't allow our most precious places, our public lands, to become a partisan political wedge issue. So I would like to send a little message from Nathan Fay. So Nathan Fay is the director of Colorado's outdoor recreation industry, and he was actually supposed to be out here speaking tonight. Unfortunately, he and his wife fell ill, and they could not travel. He could not travel. But he's incredibly appreciative of the partnership with Western that the office has, that the work that is happening through the Daniels Fund and the Ethics Institute. And thank you very much for having us out here tonight. And what I would like to do is give you one of my favorite quotes as a parting thought. Edward Abbey, the iconoclast. It's not enough to fight for the land. It is even more important to enjoy it. While you can, while it's still here. So get out there and hunt and fish and mess around with your friends. Ramble out yonder and explore. Climb the mountains, bag the peaks, run the rivers. Breathe deep of that yet sweet and lucid air. Sit quietly for a while and contemplate the precious stillness, the lovely, mysterious, and awesome space. So thank you again for what you're doing. Thank you for the invitation tonight. And with that, shall we open up to some questions?
question. What kind of agreements are the states entering into with each other? You mentioned that they've each opened up offices and that sort of thing. What are they doing to work together?
Excellent question. And so there's a process called the Confluence Accords. And so all the original 8 states got together, and they all have advisory councils. And using those councils, they went through a process to come up with the pillars that were primarily based upon what Colorado had already came through with. And so they went through a process of making sure that those could be executed under a Republican governor and administration, under a Democratic governor administration, and that's how you've had states of all different political stripes be able to sign on to those. But it's primarily the same, and conservation and stewardship is one of those prime values that all the states that have signed on to do as part of this confluence states. And so they signed the Confluence Accords, and I believe that was about a year ago, a little over a year ago. And there's a process for other states. So just creating an office doesn't actually get you into the confluence of states. You have to adopt and ratify within the administration of the new state the principles of the Confluence Accords.
Right, I just have a quick question for you. So you talked about ways to preserve the land. You mentioned perhaps there might need to be some taxes or fees associated with preserving the land here in Colorado. I was just kind of wondering if that is an idea, it's a valid idea, how would that make it more accessible to those that already cannot afford to participate, as you were saying in another part of your speech?
It would not. And so that's why something like what New Mexico has done with the Outdoor Equity Fund would be an appropriate way, perhaps, to counter the effect of doing some type of fees or having some type of tax. So if a tax is broad-based, it means more people will participate in the supporting of the land, and then there'll be less impact on individual people. But no matter how you do it, you are going to have to think about the ripple effects from that and how you counter those ripple effects. And so New Mexico has one good way of doing that with the equity fund, to actually fund getting low-income youth out into nature, either through educational programs or through outdoor recreation programs.
So I guess I'm next. Over here. Thanks for your presentation. You had mentioned that funding effectively for our open spaces is going down despite the population increase. Can you explain why that's happening? And I guess the second part of it is there an obvious answer to reverse that trend?
So at the local level, generally counties, cities, municipalities have good success at passing local funding initiatives. It is the federal government and the federal agencies that are starved for cash at this point. And that goes all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot when the Forest Service was originally created. It has been a battle of funding those agencies since that very time. And so if you can't dismantle that agency, what you do is you don't fund it. And so there's no clear way, at least for us within Colorado, to rectify what's happening at the federal levels. There's certainly, you get politically involved, things like that. But for us to directly deal with what we have in terms of to deal with in growth in Colorado, I think that's going to have to happen at the state level. There was a second question too, right?
Well, you sort of answered it with the state, but is there an obvious, new licenses, how do you fill the void?
Yeah, so the things that have been talked about would be right now you already have hunting and fishing licenses, so you could try to extend that either on a voluntary basis or phase in type of a mandatory basis for other users of the outdoors. So that's one thing that has been batted around. You could look at different things that you could register, like already, much like the hunters and anglers, the motorized users, they have registration fees and tags, so they're generating money back into the lands as well. You could do something like that with mountain bikes or e-bikes, but the pool of money is relatively small. So then you start talking about things like, does there need to be a fee that's paid on outdoor recreation gear, where the users of that gear, they're going to be putting money back into the system to help preserve these lands. One of the complexities there is that isn't very popular with a lot of the outdoor recreation industry, because nobody wants their products to be less competitive. And if you have an excise tax, then suddenly you're getting hit. And then even more so if you're doing that at the state level, because other states don't have it, and then other states become more competitive. You can always do a broad-based sales tax, which is often what happens at the local level. But then again, trying to get Colorado to vote for taxes, there's a hump there as well. But it's going to take a lot of thought, and it's going to take a lot of effort, but it's worthwhile.
So do you know of any initiatives locally that support local businesses in the outdoor recreation market? Essentially what I'm asking is, how do we prevent things like Chinese mountain bikes from being imported and increasing carbon footprints while we're trying to protect the outdoors in the same breath? Are there any local initiatives to support local businesses in the outdoor industry specifically?
There are, and Nathan Fay, the director of the office, would be better to get into the specifics of those. But the Office of Economic Development and International Trade has a bunch of programs that are specifically aimed at rural communities. And the outdoor recreation is specifically, it works well for local communities and rural communities because, one, you're adjacent to the resource, right? The trails are there in your community. The people are traveling to your community. They're going to the local brewery, they're staying in the local hotels. And so there's actually a lot more opportunity in the outdoor recreation industry than there might be in the Front Range. And the same for manufacturing. And so there are incentives to bring manufacturing back into local communities. I don't have the names of the programs specifically, but the folks from the office would certainly have that. But yes.
I want to follow up kind of on three things. So there is kind of an excise tax happening, kind of informally in the outdoor industry, which the suppliers are essentially tithing, right? They're paying 1% of revenue, something like that. But they're scattered. They're doing a lot of different things. So some of them are access, some of them are direct political action, some of them are lobbying efforts, that kind of thing. So it'll be. This is incumbent in our industry to try to figure out how to better organize so that those efforts are focused on specific things that we're trying to achieve. Two more really quick. I'd love to hear myself talk a little faster, so forgive me. That's a joke, you're supposed to laugh. The second was this idea of bipartisanship, and that protection of the natural environment isn't or shouldn't be a partisan issue. Hopefully a number of you know, the president who signed the EPA Act into existence was Richard Nixon. Right? So it's possible. And then finally, more philosophically, this is dear to my heart, and Ed Abbey is one of my favorite authors. Another is much previous generation, and responsible for the entire idea of national parks in the first place. And he said, when you go outdoors, don't hike, saunter. And the origination of the word saunter is from the early days when people would go off to the Holy Land on their pilgrimages. And people would ask you, where are you going? And it was à la sainteté, which is French for to the Holy Land. And so that's where the word saunter comes from. We're sauntering. And so if we have that attitude when we go out to the outdoors, we're not there to commune with our gear. We're not there to hike 20-foot cliffs. We're there we're already in the sainteté. And that sort of philosophical approach, I think, fits really well with that.
And it's a beautiful thing. And we're here to talk about ethics, and some of them are quandaries, right? And so we got to wrap our brains around them, and it's not fun. But it's a beautiful thing that we've been able to take something that we love, outdoor recreation, whatever our sport happens to be, whatever our saunter through the woods happens to be, and we've been able to turn that into jobs for our neighbors, a political and economic force within our state. And it's all based on our love of these sports, our love of the land. And that's a beautiful thing. So let's not lose sight of that either.
I think I can talk loud enough. Does the government or does the state ever frame this as a health issue? That it's healthy to be outside, and there are great peripheral benefits to our well-being, that those who are outside generally have a much more optimistic outlook, become better leaders, better thinkers, and so forth. Have we done that enough?
Perhaps not enough, but yes, to a certain degree. And so that is one of the pillars of the Office of Outdoor Recreation Industry. And it might have been one that I skipped earlier, and I apologize if I did. But it does, the office does look at the health effects. And in fact, under the previous director, published a fairly extensive report specifically on the impacts for health and all the systems that surround that. So an integrative approach to actually trying to get outdoors and things like nature prescriptions. Because you could do that right now, but your doctor doesn't get any type of compensation for writing a prescription for somebody to get outdoors. So you have to start integrating those into all these other external systems. Like there's got to be a code within the insurance, so you can actually code that and bill for it. So they've undertaken some preliminary and fairly deep studies on how you would do that. So that was Jeanette who actually produced that study, and there's a good body of work out there.
I can probably talk loud enough too. Thanks for your presentation. One of the questions I have is through these confluence of states doing, setting up government agencies, how we talked about a little bit about fees potentially on like paying a little extra for buying a mountain bike that goes to outdoor. Has there, how much liaise goes between the government agencies and these outdoor companies making the bikes and the ropes and the gear to either participate, contribute, help with the government part of it, bringing in the private industry? How much of that goes on?
Quite a bit, and that's what the offices are really for. And so before I said that the office has done a lot to galvanize the industry, and it's kind of an inside joke because if you've ever heard Luis Benitez speak, he says that like 15 different times. But it is true. And so so I was at a recreational nonprofit, and we saw these offices starting to get created. We were kind of scratching our head, like, what are you going to really do? So you appoint somebody within the governor's cabinet, to talk about outdoor recreation. What are we really going to get out of this? And talked a little about the story in Utah, where really this was a mea culpa on the part of Utah for some of their policies. But what happened is that suddenly the industry, because of that coordination that was happening between the government, the state government, and the governor's office, and the industry started to understand that it was powerful and that it had a seat at the table. And so when it comes to things like bringing the OR show over to Colorado, there was a lot of interplay between Luis Benitez and the office and the private industry, the players of the outdoor recreation industry, to make that happen. And likewise, the members of the Office of Outdoor Recreation Industry have to step away from certain political activities. But they've set up these institutions like the Outdoor Recreation Advisory Council, the Colorado Outdoor Recreation Partnership, where all these industry folks are working together and they can take action independent of the offices. And so they don't have the same shackles that somebody who might wear the director's hat at the OREC office. So that really has been the learning lesson for me, coming from kind of the head scratching of like, what are these offices going to do, to seeing kind of this magical inflection point where everybody's like, oh, we employ a lot of people, and since we employ a lot of people, our senators take our phone calls, and we can go down and sit down and have a conversation with them, and we can tell them what we really need, and then things happen like you have Gardner and Bennett, who are writing letters, joint letters in support of Land and Water Conservation Fund, and taking, we have very progressive positions, or very pro-lands positions, I will say, coming from all sides of the political aisle. And that's because the industry has been organized in such a way, largely at the request and at the, kind of the push of the button from folks that are running these offices.
Is there a way for the state to make gear and education more acceptable to rural and urban communities? Like, what are they currently doing today to make that accessible for those communities?
In terms of outdoor education
In terms of outdoor education, as well as access to how you can bring trails and introducing people to the outdoors, if that makes sense.
And so a lot of that is happening within the private sector. So you have nonprofit organizations of all different varieties, like Trips for Kids, and like Big City Adventures. And so these groups have been the ones that have been leading that effort to do environmental education. And then you have larger players within the industry, like some of the foundations and REI. They've been trying to bring all these groups together and have them scale up their efforts, because there are a lot of scattered efforts out there. And there's a lot of different, it's interesting because there's a lot of different philosophical and perhaps ethical questions about what the right approach to education is, and specifically environmental education. And so trying to bridge some of those divides that even happen within those communities is the role that some of the larger industry players have been taking. I'm not as aware as much of that's happening from the state government side on those access. But again, the New Mexico example is a great example of how a state government could step in and take a role, not to be the actual service provider and actually running the education or the outdoor recreation program, but to hand out grants to these organizations that are already existing so they can scale up their efforts and bring more people from low-income communities into the outdoors.
Had Governor Polis named you the director of the Office of Outdoor Recreation Industry, what significant change would you make in the office in your first year to be more impactful in the state?
Well, Nathan, who is the newly minted director of the Office of Outdoor Recreation, is a good friend of mine. So, but I think that I do look back, because you say, okay, we're growing. We have these out. What do we love about Colorado? Let's just start there. Like, what is it that brings us here, that keeps us here? What does it make Colorado special? And if we can kind of collectively, through a conversation around the state, one, decide what that is. Because I think if we asked everybody in this room, we'd have a slightly different variation of what that is. And a lot of times we do, like, oh, we're worried about this growth, we're worried about these things, it's gonna harm what we love. Change is bad. But I don't know that we all have one idea of what it is that we love. And so getting to that point where we kind of have a community kind of large agreement on what that is. And so the way you do that is largely what's happened before. We can look to history, we can look at what happened to create Great Outdoors Colorado, which started with a listening tour around the state, presenting these problems, and then presenting the solutions, and then going down the path of whatever it be, legislative or a ballot initiative, whatever it takes, then to pass the appropriate changes, the appropriate policies to get these things done. But yeah, so that's what I would hope to see coming out of a new administration, is to convene that conversation in a way that we can all get behind a certain set of policy changes. Any other questions?
So I'm wondering if either there's been initiatives started or maybe possible ways that that we can support our local state parks, some of whom have had the same budget for the last 12 years.
So a real quick way that you can help them is buy a state parks pass. And so there's already that fee structure out there, but of course it's voluntary. Anytime you go into a state park, there is a state park fee, but all that money stays within the state park system. So for your federal lands, there's also a federal lands pass, and so you can also buy that type of pass as well. There isn't an active initiative right now to rectify some of these issues, but I think you'll see some emerging perhaps as early as the 2020 cycle. It's probably too late for 2019 because a number of reasons, but so watch for that to happen. But what needs to happen before that is that conversation needs to happen. Right? People need to raise these issues, and you can do that. And so you can go out and you show up at the local county commissioners meeting, and you can ask questions about this. How are we going to deal with this? And we heard that there's different ways to do that. And so tomorrow, I think, would be a great time to engage in a conversation about the ethical responsibilities of the outdoor recreation industry to protect the places that we play and love. Another one I'll offer up is Colorado does have a state water plan. And that state water plan is in the process of being funded as well. And just like I often talk about land, it's inseparable to talk about land and not water. And so the state water plan is kind of the core piece of planning, and it started again with a statewide conversation, and now has a real plan to provide sustainable water resources for the state for the next 50 years or so. So that's another one that you could look at.
I just have a question. How do you plan for the contingency that you have to stop tourism? And we see that this last summer in Europe, where some towns, destinations cut visitor numbers because the resources cannot support, like Santorini, Dubrovnik, Chicotera, come areas that have reduced the number of tourists. Do you have a contingency plan for that if the pressures get so high in Colorado?
So I'm not aware of that, and I'm not sure what mechanism that you would use for doing that. I think often the reaction of folks that have lived in the state for a while or their entire lives is, let's just close the gate behind us. But I'm not quite sure how you do that, and I'm not sure how you do it from a tourism perspective either. How do they do it there?
Well, it's normally tickets to cruise lines and so on that they allow to come into the harbors. The access tickets are visitors going to train systems, for example.
Yeah. And I don't know that we'd have like similar like ingress egress points that we could regulate in that type of a way.
Well, we've actually started it. Hanging Lake.
Well, that's true. That's true.
Is the first domino, and we'll probably see more and more as land agencies begin to kind of be challenged with that very question: is how do we protect this resource? And we have to say, look, what's the amount of people who can actually see this a year? So Hanging Lake is the first domino, and I think we'll probably see more.
And I guess you've seen for a long time you've had similar things on water. So if you're going to paddle down certain stretches of water, you're going to have to get a permit to do so. So you do have those types of restrictions, temporal restrictions, things of that nature. But the hope would be that we can find better ways to fund our recreation infrastructure, distribute people into places instead of into the crowded areas that they go right now, to where we can avoid that.
So my question kind of relates to what we've already been talking about concerning the national areas. And a lot has been talked about fees and figuring out ways to throw more money at the problem. Do you think there's a way to increase the volunteer efforts to help these problems? Like trail crews, people coming in and just doing work for free.
Yes, but I'll start by saying that volunteer work is free as in free puppies. So you still have to manage them, and so there still needs to be a structure so that can actually absorb that. And one of the problems that we have right now, there's a lot of people who raise their hand who would like to go out and volunteer, But the federal agencies are so strapped that they don't really have the ability to approve projects at times, because they have to go through the NEPA process, the National Environmental Protection Act, and so there's these different layers that they have to get through even before they're able to manage the volunteers, and so providing resources to where they can do so is a necessary component to that. But that's a roundabout way of saying yes, and so there's groups that are working on that specifically right now, and the statewide stewardship initiative first started in 2017 and 2018, or 2018, yeah, and now is going through its second phase that's asking exactly that question. And so it's gathering all the organizations that are outdoor stewardship organizations that run volunteers and trying to move the state away from this model of nonprofits often chase money, right? And so you get money for a given project, but it's not very strategic. And so moving from kind of a one project, one-off type approach to a strategic approach where we sit down and understand, again, what it is that we really value and what we're trying to preserve about Colorado, and then coming up with a plan for addressing that through volunteer stewardship where it can be used, and then getting organizations to align behind that instead of everybody running in different directions. And so organizations like Great Outdoors Colorado, the Gates Family Foundation, locally here in Colorado, have been pushing the outdoor stewardship community in that direction to where they can scale up their efforts. And that's going to be a big part of it for sure.
I have a question about the Outdoor Recreation Industry Office, and what is the biggest hurdle you see some of the other states that are trying to get one, and what is the pushback from the states that don't have one or don't have plans to?
Well, California is an interesting example because California had legislation that created an Office of Outdoor Recreation that was then vetoed by its governor. And that was largely around just who is the leader of the office. There are already different offices, because think about Colorado. In most states you have the Department of Natural Resources, you might have a Division of Wildlife, you might have parks. For us, Parks and Wildlife have been combined. And so somebody might be losing part of the responsibilities and job title if you create an office that's specifically taking these under one hat. And so you see some of that, just kind of normal, kind of political power, if you will. And some states don't want to attack it in the same way. So the states that have gotten behind the Confluence Accords want to get behind these 4 pillars. They want to make sure that we're preserving the places that we play. And other states just handle it a little bit differently. Their recreation might be different. Their recreation areas might be different. Kansas is a classic example. They've had somebody who's in this type of a role for quite a while, but it doesn't resemble the Colorado's office or Montana's office or Wyoming's office. And so sometimes you get on different sides of just political divides as well, because when you start talking about the preservation of the resource, and when the resource you're talking is kind of an environmental resource, that plays better with a certain part of the political spectrum than others. So you deal with that as well.
So I'm curious now, if we're concerned about preserving these lands and using some taxpayer money to this, would you advocate for something similar to the Civilian Conservation Corps?
Wouldn't that have been a beautiful thing during the recession?
Yep.
If you'd asked me the question about what have I done the first year of the office, if you asked me that in 2008, yeah, get the Civilian Conservation Corps back together and send them around the country to work on civilian works projects. How beautiful would that have been? But that would be nice. And you might be able to wrap that up into something I really haven't thought about in the context of what we're dealing with right now. But if you think about the question prior about volunteer outdoor stewardship, and a lot of what we're seeing in terms of volunteerism is that if you want to, it's privileged to volunteer, right? You have to have enough time, you have to have enough income, to walk away and donate your time to something that you care about. And there's a lot of people who would love to do that who simply don't have the ability, right? They're at home, they may be, be the only breadwinner for their children, their parents. And so you have both the Civilian Conservation Corps model and the Youth Corps model. And those are stipended volunteers. And so they're still classified as a volunteer, but they are getting compensation. and it might not be compensation at a rate that qualifies as employment. But you could potentially, if you had, if you think about, some type of a package that once, if we want to think holistically about some of these things that we want to tackle, it might include, trying to scale up volunteer stewardship. It might include a very robust volunteer program that's actually a stipended Civilian Conservation Corps type program. And what a better way to introduce folks to the outdoors, get them to feel a kinship with the outdoors, and then to fall in love with it, to fight for it, to vote for it, and fund that through some of the funding mechanisms that we've talked about. I think I'm getting the hook. Thank you.